Public spaces are meant to bring people together, to offer rest, shelter, and a sense of belonging. But what if these very spaces were designed to push certain people out? What if the places we think of as open and accessible are in reality built to exclude? This is the reality around defensive urbanism, a design strategy that prioritizes security and order over inclusivity. You may not always notice it, but it's all around us. Examples include benches with armrests that prevent lying down, spikes placed on ledges to keep skateboarders away, underpasses lit with harsh strobe lights to deter people from gathering, or even music to make the space less attractive for undesirable behavior. These are all examples of defensive urbanism, and while they are said to help maintain order, they often target marginalized groups, making public spaces feel less public. Montreal, like many other cities around the world, has embraced those design choices, ranging from subtle types of defensive designs to more obvious ones. And the result is a city that becomes harder to navigate for those who need it most. People experiencing homelessness, people with disabilities, the elderly, families with young children, or even people who are ill. The absence of public washrooms, shaded rest areas, and sitting options doesn't just discourage certain behaviors, it makes everyday life more difficult for everyone. In this interview, I talk with Kira Shilou, a leading researcher and advocate in the fight against defensive urbanism. We explore how defensive urbanism shapes Montreal and other cities, the growing resistance to this exclusionary design, and what it would take to build spaces that truly belong to everyone. To learn more on the topic, keep watching. Perfect. So, hi, Kara. Thank you so much for being here with us today. So, first, I wanted to know if you could please state your name, your title, and your organization.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for inviting me to speak with you today. My name is Kara Shalou. I am a PhD candidate in urban planning, policy, and design at McGill University. And I am the founder and creator of a project called Defensive TO, which began in Toronto about when I finished my master's, so almost 10 years ago now. Um, and it basically is a project that documents and investigates instances of defensive or hostile design throughout the city of Toronto and then beyond. So now I'm based here in Montreal.
So, I was wondering if you could please introduce the Defensive Urbanism Research Network, Defensive TO, and Defensive Montreal.
Yeah, absolutely. So the Defensive Urbanism Research Network was basically a way to start to gather folks who are interested in defensive or hostile design. The group started on Facebook, so it's actually not a really great platform for it now. So I'm looking to take it off of Meta of their platform and perhaps create like an email list or something. But I've been in contact with a bunch of scholars and practitioners who are interested in investigating the phenomenon more, and some people that are advocating, like myself, also for either regulating it or removing it. Defensive TO is a project that I started about 10 years ago out of my master's. I did my master's in urban planning at York University. And the project it started off as basically documenting instances of defensive or hostile design um, whenever I encountered it in the city of Toronto. And the project grew from there. I created a website. I started to map these instances that I saw. And so this project, Defensive TO, is really a jumping off point for my PhD research, which continues to look at defensive or hostile design. And Defensive MTL or Defensive Montreal is an Instagram account that I've started here. I'm based now in Montreal. So I've been continuing my work that I started in Toronto and looking at different occasions and instances of hostile design here in the city.
Thank you. So, I know you kind of talked a little bit about it, but how did you first become aware of defensive urbanism or hostile architecture, and what motivated you to address it?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I originally was studying in my master's. I've always been very much interested in public space and the politics surrounding public space, who gets to access it, who gets to use it for what activities. I'm originally from Northern Ontario, from Sudbury. So when I moved to Toronto, it was just, it's a different built form, similar to Montreal. There's a lot of, it's an older city, so there's a lot of traditional public spaces, parks, and plazas, something that um, we didn't have as much in Sudbury because it was very much like a post-war developed kind of city, very kind of spread out and sprawled. And so when I moved to Toronto, I became very interested in urban activism, things like critical mass, reclaiming the streets in certain ways. Um, and one day I was at Toronto City Hall, Nathan Phillips Square, the public space outside of the City Hall. And I was just kind of observing a redeveloped section of the square. And it was like newly redeveloped. And I saw embedded in some of the curbs these pretty large metal protrusions that were embedded in the curbs, meant to keep people from skateboarding on the curbs. And when I saw that, I thought it was kind of strange because I had known about instances of hostile design or defensive architecture before, but I thought it was something that we knew was not working, we knew was potentially discriminatory, and that we'd be actually removing from our public spaces instead of putting them into new public spaces. So that really sparked my interest in the whole phenomenon. In a urban planning and design field, that talks a lot about inclusion and access and recognizing the value of public space. It really was surprising to me that there's this other trend, design trend, that was happening almost simultaneously to control access and to restrict certain behaviors, or attempting to restrict certain behaviors in public space as a form of um, supposedly crime prevention or social control. And it's really linked up to protecting property and also protecting capital investment in public space. So over the last 20 years or so, there's been a lot of development, especially in Canada, bringing development back to downtowns, back into the city. And part of the way to make these developments attractive to people to move into them and to buy new condominium units is to create really exciting and aesthetically pleasing public spaces. Um, Also, what's been going on in the last 20 years or so is this incredible decline in affordable housing, in public housing. People, there's been, like, I think in Montreal, I saw a number like homelessness has doubled since the pandemic. People are calling out, so-called housing crises, across the province, across the country, across North America. So there's really something big going on here. So as we're kind of redeveloping certain spaces for a certain public, then there's at the same time, these spaces are now being kind of securitized in order to keep out people that are seen to devalue the space, or people that are using it in unintended ways. So the biggest target of defensive or hostile design is people who are visibly unhoused. The folks that are the most visible, maybe they're not even unhoused, but are most visibly in public space, maybe doing things linked to what people conceive as like social disorder, so like drinking or panhandling, these like really minor, in a lot of circumstances, they're not even crimes. They're considered like uh, like incivilities. And so there's this kind of trend that's been going on that I've been kind of researching and observing both in Toronto and in Montreal and beyond.
Thank you. And to go back a few steps, um, for those who are unaware, could you explain what, I know you kind of did, but could you explain what defensive design and a hostile architecture is?
Absolutely. So, hostile design, defensive architecture, they're two different words for the same phenomenon. There's a lot of different words used to describe this. So, I tend to use the term defensive design, defensive urbanism, to kind of encapsulate things, objects, devices that are not just like architectural features. Um, so, hostile design and defensive architecture is known by multiple terms. Other terms that people might have encountered would be like disciplinary architecture, exclusionary design, unpleasant design. But hostile design really has kind of come out recently as the most common term to describe a similar phenomenon. And so basically, all these terms describe a design and governance practice that uses parts of the built environment, parts of like public space and urban space to restrict people's behavior or like restrict people from accessing space or to like restrict certain behaviors that are deemed undesirable or to guide certain behaviors. This takes many different forms, these kind of design interventions. And the most common ones that you might see would be a bench that is, it has a center bar installed on it to keep people from lying down, ledges where you have metal spikes or just little metal protrusions. They could be even rounded to keep people from skateboarding, but also to keep people from maybe sitting or occupying a space. And then one form that I've been looking at a lot is not so visible, and this is the absence of public amenities, um, like seating and public washrooms and places of shelter and shade that are often included in public space or have been traditionally included in public spaces to make them welcoming and to support people's well-being while out, in public outside of the private home. But these amenities are now missing. So they're either not included in the design process, or maybe they were once there, but they were removed, or maybe it's in disrepair or has reduced hours of operation. And so, a great example of this, of the removal, something that I call ghost amenities, these like traces of this ideal of urban life. Um, these In my neighborhood of Milton Park, close to McGill, there was a plaza outside of this big apartment complex that used to have benches, a bunch of benches, and I would often see community members hanging out and sitting. Um, but in April of last year, all these benches were removed, and so folks might not notice that there's anything wrong with the space if you didn't have the context that there were once benches there, but now they're removed, and it's just a very kind of stark, uh, not really inviting public space anymore. You can't really use it in the way that it was formerly used. So yeah, and this design strategy often is used to target anyone like groups of people that are seen to be using these public spaces in undesirable ways. And so, like what is undesirable? Like that's something to definitely unpack undesirable for who, like who gets to dictate these kind of rules. Um, but yeah, that's just a bit of a intro to that.
Thank you. So you did mention, for example, that you live in Milton Park, and you mentioned the example of the benches, right? And earlier in the conversation, you also mentioned like things like spikes, for example, or things that keep people from skateboarding. Do you have examples, other examples of what you've seen specifically in Montreal, for example? That's hostile architecture, defensive design.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question. And before I kind of dive into that answer, I just want to mention kind of the reason I often use the term defensive rather than hostile to describe this practice, even though hostile design is the most commonly used term at the moment. Um, to say something is hostile is to make a judgment. It's a value judgment. It's a normative claim. To say something is good or bad, hostile or hospitable. And yeah, definitely, there are so many examples of this design trend that is very, very hostile and should be named as such. But overall, to name this whole trend of securitizing the built environment as hostile, you know, there is some good debate about that. But I tend to use the term defensive because it describes what the practice is doing. It defends space against unwanted use. Um, and uh, so a good example of that would be I see increasingly items like planter boxes or bike racks that are used, that are installed in like alcoves and under underpasses, and they're used as objects to deter people from using the space, from maybe sitting there seeking refuge or setting up an encampment. So these items aren't inherently hostile. They don't look hostile. They're not designed to be hostile. They're designed actually for other purposes, but they're used in a hostile way to restrict space. So I like to say that, defensive design or defensive urbanism creates hostile environments, but yeah, that is not to say that there's definitely some great examples of hostile design. And so, one great example of hostile design in Montreal that was removed actually about a decade ago was around the Barry UCAM station outside of a music store. There were these so called anti homeless spikes that were installed to keep people from sitting on the sidewalk in front of the store. These spikes were overtly hostile. There was no way to argue that they weren't um, to keep unhoused folks or street folks from sitting there. And because it was inherently hostile, it really kind of made media headlines. And even at the time, the Mayor Coder at the time, also called out the spikes as hostile and ugly. But there's many examples of hostile design, of defensive design throughout Montreal. Um, at first, that was a bit surprising to me because I had assumed, given the reputation of Montreal being very pedestrian friendly, very people friendly, really a lot of cities across North America now look to Montreal for design ideas and design trends. It's not as overt. You won't see um, the hostile benches throughout the city in the same way that you might see in other places. But you'll see these hostile designs or defensive designs in certain parts of the city, especially in parts that are huge circulation areas like transit stations and major roads. Major kind of like tourist and business districts like the Quartier de Spectacle. Um, or also places that are traditionally known for some lower income folks like the Village or Point St. Charles. There's these different instances. So for example, recently, I think it was a couple months ago, I saw on the news that Place des Jardins in Quartier de Spectacle was playing really loud music, um, children, a really like annoying children's music in certain stairways and exits as a way to move along unhoused folks. Um, and this is a tactic. So, and this is why I use the term like urbanism or design rather than architecture as well, because these interventions, they can be, you know, like physical interventions, as I mentioned, like seating or fences or barriers, but they can also be like sensory interventions. So light and sound um, is also commonly used to kind of like change how a space is experienced. You know, music and sound is used often to make a space uncomfortable so that you don't want to hang out there. But of course, it makes it uncomfortable for everyone. And also, you know, these tactics are targeting folks that are already like very marginalized, very vulnerable, you know, often hard on their luck, you know, like they don't need any more hostility directed towards them. And so, yeah, this use of music being weaponized. You know, it could be children's songs. In the past, you know, classical music was used, but it was used more like back in Toronto. I think like in the early 2000s, there was this idea that classical music um, would be used to move along teenagers who used to congregate in some of the transit stations. It was kind of used to prevent so called gang activity, with this assumption, I guess, that teenagers don't like classical music. But now music has been used in classical music as well, not so much with the thought of it being uncool, but it's just used in volumes. And the type of music that's used is meant to be very irritating. So if it's not children's songs, you might hear really frantic classical music or really frantic jazz. Like it's meant to be uncomfortable and yeah, not to have people around. Um, Another thing with using sound in this way is that, you know, folks, for example, who are hard of hearing, who use hearing aids, this kind of like weaponized sound can be very like harmful and jarring for people that use them. So there's these unintended consequences as well when you're targeting the most vulnerable, most marginalized community members to make a space uncomfortable or unlivable. You're making space hostile for everyone else as well. Um, and so that's something that I like to mention. And finally, a third example of defensive or hostile design that I've heard about was, so there is, you know, you'll see defensive benches that have the center bar, as I mentioned, but also you'll see different bench designs. Maybe there's like a single seat instead of a bench. Um, or maybe it's not even a bench, it's kind of almost like a leaning surface. And so I had a friend send me a picture in Point St. Charles about these leaning benches. And, you know, it's like I just always bring up, you know, back to people who have accessibility needs, you know, like not including benches in the city for fear of them being used by unhoused folks, you know, especially designing them so they can't even be sat upon. It creates barriers in the built environment for people with disabilities, for people with accessibility needs. And there's actually laws in place. I'm not exactly sure what the laws are in the Quebec context, but I know for sure in Ontario, there's laws about not putting further barriers in the built environment. And so, you know, as I mentioned before, these kind of design decisions have serious implications for all kinds of folks and not just people who have been marginalized in our current society.
Thank you. I'm just gonna pause the interview real quick, just to because I hear an echo. Give me one sec. Well, it's not working anyway, so it's fine. But to get back to the interview, I do think it's very interesting that you're mentioning all these things. Like, for example, I was gonna mention the bars that you often find in metros or other places that are supposed to be for so people can lean. And will often have, like, people will say that the idea of it is to make it easier for people to stand up, right? Because you don't have to sit down completely. So then you're just leaning and you just can push yourself up. So it's easier to stand up. And I do think that you mentioning the benches, for example, uh, I feel like a lot of people kind of believe that this is like beautification or it's artsy or even like again it has another like use, right? Again, going back to the leaning stations, um, which I think is very interesting. So who I know you kind of answered that, but who have you seen disproportionately affected by these designs and architectures?
Hmm. Yeah, so you're absolutely right. The leaning bars in the metro, I believe, are more um, performative accessibility rather than real accessibility. I would love to talk to older adults and people with disabilities to actually see, like, if they use it. I've never seen someone lean on it before. Um, I would bet that older adults would appreciate ergonomically designed seating, so seating that is built for the human form, seating that supports the human form. And so proper seating not only includes like a place to put your bum on, but it often includes a backrest as well, because some people need to be able to lean back and to have that support. Sometimes armrests um, are used for accessibility. Sometimes they can help people get on and off the bench, but this feature has also been weaponized. I wrote an article a couple years ago that you can find in Azure magazine that really kind of looks to debunk this idea that the center bar, the center armrest on benches, is an accessibility measure. Because if it were to be an accessibility measure, other things need to be considered. So if you see a bench that just has a center bar, but without a backrest, it's not for accessibility because you need to have these other things in place. You need to have a clear path to the bench. Like if you have this bench with a center bar in the middle of a field, like that's not accessible. It's not meant for accessibility. Um, and so yeah. Also, sometimes these designs aren't standardized, so you'll see these benches that might have this so-called center armrest, but the armrest is like it's not high enough to actually be used to leverage yourself to get off of. So, and you'll see these benches designed where these like so-called armrests are so close together that people of different sizes can't actually sit on the bench. And so there's all these things in place that, like, yeah, maybe it looks nice, but I don't know who is actually testing out these benches. And often, like, I've heard from designers too, um, that there is this kind of trend or this idea about creating urban amenities, especially in places where there's like a lot of people moving through. You want to create amenities that might like look attractive to like sit on for like 10 or 15 minutes but aren't really comfortable for prolonged use. And so actually that's something that has been considered in the design of some of these amenities and spaces. Um, and when we design our spaces, to restrict folks that that we deem undesirable, or folks that other folks are uncomfortable around, it really makes the built environment inaccessible for everyone. And so a lot of folks that really are disproportionately affected, besides folks targeted, unhoused folks, mostly, and street folks, and other people that have been marginalized in that way. Um, not having benches, not having washrooms, it makes it really hard for older adults, for people with disabilities, families with young children to be able to navigate the city as well. You need, there are studies out there that shows that you need to have benches. That benches are required for older adults to be mobile, to use like public transportation. There's all kinds of stuff out there, especially since the pandemic when we had a real washroom crisis. In Toronto. I'm not too sure how it was in Montreal, but where we were hearing, I was hearing from folks that, myself included, like, planning your routes outside because you don't know where you're going to go. I heard about people not drinking water to limit having to go so often. Like these things have real effects, these design decisions and planning decisions. So of course, another thing that I'd like to mention too is that a lot of unhoused folks are also people who are disabled, and so this just like further just like uh, makes the city more hostile and accessible for folks that have a lot of intersecting, perhaps, like disadvantages in this ableist society.
I know we talked a lot about order and like undesirable behavior. So why do you think there is such a strong focus on maintaining order at the expense of inclusivity and accessibility?
Yeah, that's a great question. I am trying to figure out that as well. Um, I think that part of this kind of push for, the sense of order in public space is to make, that there has been for decades before, in certain cities as well, fear of urban life or fear of the city being unsafe. And so especially if you're investing, you're developing city space, urban space, downtown spaces, and you want to bring people in there, you have to figure out ways to reduce that fear. And a lot of times this fear is just, it's fear of the unknown, rather than like real risk of crime and safety. Um, so this trend to control spaces is about making them feel safe, making, there, I've heard people say that it makes spaces more accessible, um, because there's this idea that one group of people shouldn't dominate a space, but often when people talk about that, they're referring to unhoused people or like groups of young men. They're not saying there's anything wrong with a playground being dominated by like a family, for instance, or kids. And so, yeah, there's this kind of idea about, I believe it's definitely linked to creating a perception of safety, but also um, like protecting property and protecting like those investments in the built environment. So let's say you're spending like millions of dollars to develop a property, you're redeveloping the nearby public space, and then all of a sudden you have a few unhoused folks there and they've put up some tents. Like, the developers, the property owners, people who have a stake in wanting to see that development and space succeed in a certain way. Yeah, like to have these signs, so-called signs of disorder, some people are fearful of. Some for others, it reminds folks of like there are issues in society that haven't been dealt with. So there's this idea that like let's move folks along so that people don't feel uncomfortable going into these urban spaces and consuming or, you know, buying a new place.
I was wondering, in that case, like, what would truly inclusive spaces look like in cities like Montreal, for example, in your opinion?
Yeah, I don't have any answers to what a truly inclusive space would look like because I'm also still learning and still trying to figure that out. But I know that making spaces and putting amenities and elements in it that supports people's well-being would be good. Um, so making sure that we have plenty of spaces to sit with supportive seating, like proper seating. Um, that we have places to use the washroom and to get water from. That we have spaces that we can take shelter from the sun or the rain. um, and also something like just we can be creative in maybe public washrooms and parks can be some sort of community hub. Maybe it's a space where you use the washroom, but then maybe there's someone there who is staff there that has first aid training and they can help if anything happens in the park, but then they can also have a bit of knowledge about potential like services for unhoused folks. Maybe there's a shower there that folks can use when they need. So just thinking about like I really kind of take my work to like what supports human life, like what do we all need as human beings, and kind of building up from there.
Thank you. Um, so, basing on what you've seen, do you think there's a growing awareness of the harm caused by defensive design, or most people still unaware of its impact?
Yeah, I think that there definitely is a growing awareness over the past decade since I've started becoming interested in this work. Um, it went from very little resources, very little stuff written about it, to now there's like multiple scholars that have been engaging in work on it. There's all kinds of social media accounts, especially on Instagram, that documents. In addition to mine that looks at Toronto and Montreal, there's stuff across Canada, across the US, across Europe. I've even encountered folks documenting it in Japan and Singapore. Um, so there is a growing awareness, but at the same time, there's a lot of folks that aren't aware, and a part of that reason is that we often notice just really the explicit forms. So like the really gnarly looking spikes, or the very obvious benches that limit lying down. Um, but part of what's been happening with this design trend is that there's a lot of thought put into creating these forms so that people don't know it's there. So creating a bench with a center bar. I've seen with a center bar, but it's not even really a bar. It's kind of like a center wedge. So it's not very noticeable that it's there. But then, the folks who are targeted, the folks that are inhibited from sleeping know it's there because, once you lie down, there's that little nub there. So um, there definitely is this trend about making it less visible to people who aren't targeted or affected in some ways, but there's other forms that are meant to be explicit for everyone, like fences. When the encampment was removed by McGill, a part of their tactics for removing it was to put fences around the entire campus and to limit entry points. uh, and so like that's meant to be very visible. Like some of these things are meant to be very visible, to be like a sign or a signal, and other things are not meant to be. um, and so yeah, there's just kind of a challenge about that. And also this comes back to using the term hostile to describe this as well, because if you're only talking about the most explicit and hostile forms, you're missing so many different things out there that are part of this design trend that is a part of creating a more securitized, static, sterile city. But you can't even name it, you can't even identify it because it's not hostile or evil enough, and that's the thing, I'm very much interested in the stuff that it's like it's mundane, but it's still contributing to this kind of more hostile urban environment. So, like as I mentioned, you'll see a lot of like anti-skateboard stuff, the metal protrusions. Sometimes they're not spikes. Sometimes they're just little rounded knobs, and it's like, oh, that's not hostile. There's nothing bad about it, but it's a part of this larger trend. And yeah, so you can look at each individual piece and judge whether it's hostile or not. Um, but like when looking at all these things together, you're seeing like a really alarming trend. Um, and like in my research, I've seen that this stuff gets included, like the benches with the center bars or the anti-skateboard devices. They get included in public spaces. I've seen before they're even open to the public. So I've seen public spaces under construction or redeveloped, and they're behind fences still because they're being constructed, and they're putting these devices in. So even before there's any potential conflict, people are designing uh, in this way. So this has really become a best practice, um, something that's spread uh, you know throughout North America and into Europe.
Thank you. I do have a question regarding what you just said, because you did mention that now, even before public spaces are open, defensive design is even like kind of implemented in those spaces, even before people can actually um, visit them and go there, right? So, do you believe that urban designers and architects are becoming more mindful of inclusivity, or defensive elements still dominating modern public spaces?
Yeah, I'm not quite sure. And that's going to be actually a part of my research, is to really kind of understand how much knowledge people who are working in the planning and design field have about this. Um, because what I suspect is happening in some cases is that folks don't even know that there's potential issues with some of these designs. For example, in Toronto, it's very common to see the benches with the center bar, and they're just like a traditional bench equipped with a center bar, and they're everywhere. And I, I was speaking to someone with some knowledge on like how these benches get put into parks, and this person mentioned that they suspect that someone made the original order of these benches with the center bar. So there was a decision there to include that. And, even that decision, did they think it was for accessibility? Were they misguided, or did they know it was, to keep like anti-homeless architecture? So you order, 100 benches or a couple hundred benches for the city, and then every time a park or a street needs a bench, you just put it in from that stock. So it's kind of like this practical, you know, practical approach rather than much thought about like, oh, like I'm actually putting this in, because there's an issue here. Um, And so, yeah, I'm like, I would love to know how much folks who work in these professions know about the potential harmful effects to the public realm that this design trend has. Um, Yeah. Sorry, I was going to say something else, but I kind of lost my train of thought there. Could you repeat your question?
Yeah, no problem. So yeah, you were mentioning spaces that haven't that aren't open to the public yet, already having defensive, designs. So I was wondering if you believe that urban designers and architects are becoming more mindful of inclusivity, or are defensive elements still dominating modern public spaces?
Yeah, I suspect that some folks are becoming aware of the potential harmful effects. In some cases, I believe also the practice um, is kind of spread, is kind of taught as this kind of practical approach for crime prevention and for safety. So, in my research, I've noticed that like one of the main kind of ways that planners and designers kind of learn about creating like safe urban environments is through this design theory called crime prevention through environmental design. And it's known by other names as well, like secured by design, situational crime prevention, designing out crime. And this this design concept puts forward the idea that if you design the built environment in a certain way, it's going to reduce real and perceived crime. So it's going to like reduce crime, but also fear of crime. And it does this through three main strategies: access control, surveillance, and um, what's called territoriality. So, this idea of like feeling ownership over space. And so, this is often taught in schools. Consultants are brought in to do continuing education classes, and so I do argue that there is a direct connection between defensive or hostile design and with this design trend, crime prevention through environmental design. Um, I argue that defensive design is the explicit, uh, material kind of manifestation of some of these principles put in place. So, access control, this idea of controlling access. Well, you put up fences. Well, you don't want people to lie down on the bench. You put up the center bar that restricts access. You want surveillance. Well, you put in bright lights so that you can see people. Um, but I do want to make the distinction that not all crime prevention through environmental design or CEPTED principles result in defensive or hostile architecture, because there are some good things that they kind of these strategies as well. For instance, lighting on a dark path is good. Especially for me as a woman navigating. I want to be able to see who's around me. Same with making sure that like plants and other trees are cut down so that you can have good sight lines. But this isn't always good. There's some people that want privacy, so having these kind of principles are kind of put as like these guidelines, but really you can't. You need flexibility, actually, like when you're designing spaces, like um so planners and designers, architects, I believe that some of them are implementing some of these defensive or hostile design strategies because it's associated with SEPDED, because they think it's a strategy for crime prevention and for safety. And I'm finding out that actually there's requirements for people to get training in SEPTED or to bring in these consultants to consult upon these places. And so when this is normalized and when people think about it as like, oh, well, this is a way to achieve like safety, um, I'm concerned that it's being put in under those premises. But like I'm looking at what are the implications of this. For one, people are very adaptable. That putting these design features in the built environment, people can circumvent them all the time. People can sleep sitting up. you know, People can still skate on curbs that have the protrusions. So often this stuff doesn't even work as intended. Um, yeah, but and this is my work to kind of expose what are some of the unintended consequences, like how it really diminishes access, um, accessibility, enjoyment, like having joyful public spaces for everyone else, for everyone, including, folks that are being excluded from the public realm. Everyone deserves to be a part of the public. Everyone deserves to have access to public space. It doesn't matter, like what your identity or position is. Maybe not every space is for every people, but we should be creating spaces, mindful that, everyone needs access to public space. And we know this especially since the pandemic when, all the private spaces closed down and we realize how important public space is for everyone.
I did wonder, because of your work, have you encountered any type of resistance from city officials, property owners, or anyone else?
Yeah, I remember a couple of years ago when my work was when I was doing some of the mapping exercises with my work, Defensive TO, and I got some media coverage in the Toronto Star and the CBC. And so I wasn't pushed back from city officials or planners, but it was just like I got some pretty like nasty emails from people in the general public that really had terrible things to say about unhoused neighbors and not thinking that people deserve access to public space. And so I've gotten some of that. But no, I haven't really seen too much pushback from, city building professionals or municipal staff. But I have heard that the folks who do crime prevention through environmental design um, are warning folks that there's potential pushback for them implementing their designs. I had a friend attend one of these sessions one time, and this former police officer mentioned that don't worry about the activist accounts like Defensive TO. These are strategies that you can use. So um, you know, the folks that are part of this urban security world, I know that they want to distance themselves from their theories connecting to defensive or hostile design. Um, and over the years, they've seen how the consequences of these theories. So they have what they call first generation septed, which has what I mentioned, the three main tenets like access control, surveillance, and territoriality. But then years later, they came up with the second generation septed, which really focuses on trying to build like more like social cohesion and not be so architecturally deterministic. So that's kind of folks in that field recognizing that there are other ways to create safety, not just through manipulating the built environment, and that safety does come is associated with the social. And then there's third generation septed. I'm not like a septed expert, so I can't like go into it too deeply, but there's third generation, and that's more recent, and they want to look at sustainability as a main, so like social sustainability, environmental sustainability, looking at that as promoting safety. And like, in a way that makes sense, but let's just kind of remember that septed, that this kind of whole design school is, based upon certain assumptions about crime and disorder and about enforcement. You know, so it's one lens of looking at safety in public space. It's not the only one. Um, so I'd be very much interested in hearing alternatives to policing and surveillance. When designing and governing public space. And I bet as we have more alternatives articulated, people that are then in the professional world will have different options to choose from. Not only this one school of thought, which is incredibly problematic as the only way to design safety into the built environment.
Thank you. So again, you've just talked about like kind of your hopes in terms of what could be next. So I was wondering, like, what is actually next for the Urbanism Research Network, Defensive Toronto, and Defensive Montreal, and
Yeah,
just your work in general.
absolutely. Yeah, so I've been switching my attention to Montreal, and so eventually, yeah, maybe I can create a map too. Starting with my own neighborhood of Milton Park. Um, so yeah, I'm just gonna continue kind of doing a little bit of work on those projects as I've been doing, but they both feed into my PhD work, which really looks to unravel, how are decisions made, who was involved with decisions, with implementing the stuff, what are the main rationales behind it, and then also looking at like what are some of the impacts on the daily life of some of our unhoused community members. And so my research is going to kind of delve deeper into that, and I hope to write up some chapters and graduate maybe next year. So I still have a little bit of work to do. um, and then with the Defensive Urbanism Research Network, yeah, so it'd be great to kind of spark that up in an alternative form. And yeah, maybe like Facebook is not the platform for it, because obviously because of all the issues with Facebook, but then also because before I was sharing lots of newspaper articles, um, of instances, and you can't even share news anymore on Facebook. So it's a totally useless platform now. But there's interest in folks connecting, maybe over email listserv. Maybe we start that. Maybe there's a way to kind of tap into. Maybe we'll start like regular meetings or something like that. But that's kind of to be determined.
Thank you. Is there anything I didn't ask that you wanted to discuss or talk about or add to the conversation?
Yeah. I think that you've asked a lot of fantastic questions, and I think that, yeah, pretty thorough conversation.
Thank you. In that case, I thank you so much, honestly, for taking the time to talk with me. We've been talking for an hour, and I appreciate your answers and you, educating me not only on the subject myself, but also other people. It's a very appreciated conversation. And yeah, I thank you for taking the time to talk with us.
Yeah,
Really
thank
appreciate it.
you. I really appreciate it as well.